The island of New Guinea. Nestled in the southwestern Pacific, it is the world's second largest island, boasting dense rainforest, towering mountain ranges, and an incredible diversity of flora and fauna. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this remote paradise became the epicenter of a blooming plume trade, driven by the Western fashion industry's insatiable demand for exotic bird feathers. Amidst this backdrop of environmental exploitation, one bird in particular, the golden-fronted bowerbird, became a symbol of mystery and loss. Presumed extinct due to the plume trade, it was rediscovered in 1981 by UCLA geography and physiology professor Jared Diamond during an expedition to the Foja Mountains in Papua, Indonesia. Diamond's remarkable find not only brought the elusive species back into the scientific spotlight, but also forever linked the Pulitzer Prize winning MacArthur Fellow and now retired professor to the island, its people, and a bird too fabulous to ever be forgotten. I'm Alvaro Castillo with the UCLA College, and this is Tell Us What You Know, an original podcast highlighting and uplifting voices from across the college's 5 divisions. Professor Diamond, New Guinea's diverse habitats range from tropical rainforest to glaciers. How does this variety of environments influence the bird species found there?
Variety of environments means variety of species adapted to those environments. There are only 3 places in the world where on the equator there is snow on the equator. There are only 3 places where there are mountains high enough on the equator to have snow. And of course, 2 of those, Mount Kilimanjaro in Kenya, and then the Andes of South America on the equator. But the third place in the world where there are snow-capped mountains on the equator is New Guinea, because New Guinea is equatorial, but the highest mountain in New Guinea is 16,500 feet. That's taller than Mount Whitney, and that's high enough that there are glaciers. The glaciers in New Guinea during the ice ages descended to maybe 7,000 feet. Today, the glaciers start at about nearly 14,500 feet. With global warming, the glaciers are retreating, they're melting. The highest glaciated mountain in New Guinea, the Carsten's Top, was climbed for the first time by the famous Austrian mountaineer Heinrich Harrer. He was the first person to climb the north face of the Eiger in the Alps. Well, in 1961, he was the first person to ascend the highest mountain of New Guinea, the Carsten's Top, which is glaciated on top. Unfortunately, with global warming, the glaciers are melting. In the year 1993, I did a project on birds a couple of dozen miles from the easternmost glacier in New Guinea, a mountain, a really steep mountain where the glacier started then at 14,000 feet, and it went up to the top of the mountain at 14,500 feet. That mountain and that glacier has been climbed only once by a Dutch team in 1961. And when I went back and flew over that glacier, what had been that glacier in 2019, it had all melted. Everything from 14,000 up to 14,500 feet was gone. So with global warming, the glaciers of New Guinea are retreating, but they're still left on the highest mountain of Indonesian New Guinea. But your question was, so what does ecological diversity have to do with bird diversity in New Guinea? Well, just as here in California, there are birds that live at sea level, and there are species that live only at high elevation. Similarly, in New Guinea, there are the richest bird fauna of New Guinea is at sea level. In the lowland rainforest, you may get, I remember one day I had 220 species birding in New Guinea lowland rainforest. But as you ascend the New Guinea mountain, you leave behind the lowland species and you encounter mountain species. At a particular elevation, you come into a new batch of species. The New Guinea species with the highest elevational range is a bird called the snow mountain robin. That bird doesn't appear until you reach 13,500 feet, and then lives from 13,500 feet up to just below the glaciers. Otherwise, in a given group of New Guinea birds, like, for example, the scrub wrens, which I've studied, you may get a sequence of 5 species changing with altitude. So in the lowlands, species number 1, Sericornis spilodera. Then from 2,000 to 3,500 feet, the off-ax scrub wren. Then 3,500 feet to 4,000 feet, the little scrub wren. Then from 6,000 to 8,000 feet, the Papuan scrub wren. And from 8,000 feet to 10,000 feet, the big scrub wren.
So it really depends on elevation and where you are located in New Guinea, where you're going to find this variety of birds, it sounds like.
Absolutely. If there's a particular bird that you want to find in New Guinea, you need to know what is its elevational range, and you go to its elevational range. For example, that bird that I mentioned, the King of Saxony bird of paradise, with these crazy wires growing out of its eyebrows and what look like bits of plastic glued along the wires. The King of Saxony bird of paradise you find only between about 6,000 and 9,000 feet, and your chances of finding it at some other elevation are 0.
That's fascinating. And I'm curious to know then, your rediscovery of the golden-fronted bowerbird in the Foja Mountains was a significant event. Can you describe that experience and its importance to ornithology?
Yes. So here is the background on the yellow-fronted bowerbird. The New Guinea birds, because New Guinea is so difficult to get around in the jungle, and New Guinea natives used to be, they would kill explorers. So for a long time, Europeans did not succeed in penetrating the mountains of New Guinea. Instead, the mountain birds of New Guinea were described from specimens collected by New Guineans and then bought by traders coming in from Dutch New Guinea and then shipped to Paris hat shops. The label simply said shipped out by this Dutch hat shop collector, but didn't say where in New Guinea the birds came from. That's how most of the birds of paradise and bowerbirds were described, from specimens that turned up in Paris hat shops. Gradually, as in the 20th century, zoologists began going to New Guinea themselves and collecting themselves, they found one after another where the hat shop birds were, until, as of about 1920, the last of the hat shop birds whose habitat had not been discovered was the yellow-fronted Gardner bowerbird. There are a series of bowerbirds called Gardner bowerbirds, and the yellow-fronted was known from 5 specimens that turned up in a Paris hat shop in 1895. Ever since then, ornithologists had been running around New Guinea with a hunch, I think it's there, but nobody found the golden-fronted bowerbird. When I was invited to New Guinea, to Indonesian New Guinea, in 1979 to set up a national park system in Indonesian New Guinea, the Indonesian government invited me there for 1 month, gave me $1,000. The government said, take these $1,000 and explore our province and recommend a national park system. So with $1,000, what do I do with $1,000 in 1 month? The most remote, unexplored, uninhabited remaining mountain range was a mountain range called the Foja Mountains. And so I thought, reasonable guess, this unexplored, uninhabited mountain range, maybe that's where the bowerbird is living. I spent my $1,000 on a helicopter to get into Foja Mountains. We tried to get into high altitudes. We discovered the helicopter saw a marsh at high altitudes. I thought, aha, land there. But the helicopter couldn't land in a marsh. Here I am in paradise and I can't land there. The helicopter had to spiral down to 2,000 feet to land on a gravel riverbed. I was crushed. I climbed up with a New Guinean. I got up to 4,500 feet, but that's not high enough for bowerbirds. 2 years later, I came back with a helicopter, and this time the helicopter pilot brought along a co-pilot who had a chainsaw and had pieces of plywood. And the co-pilot then, when we got to this marsh at 5,000 feet, jumped out into the marsh with a chainsaw, waded over to the edge of the marsh, cut down some trees, used the trees to make a support. On top of the support, put the plywood. the helicopter could then land on the plywood. I then, and the New Guineans with me, set up a camp. And the next day when I entered the forest, the first bird that I saw was the long-lost golden-fronted bowerbird. And on that day, I discovered the bower of the bird. Turns out that this bird, with its yellow crest, gathers blueberries, and it builds a circular moss platform around a tower. And to display to the female, it lowers its head so that female sees this beautiful yellow crest, and the male holds the blueberry in its mouth, so the female sees the blueberry against the background of the yellow crest. Evidently, the female really likes that.
Since your rediscovery of the golden-fronted bowerbird, have there been any additional discoveries of long-lost birds?
Yes, the mountain range in which I discovered, here's something I missed. There was also a long-lost six-wired bird of paradise. There were birds of paradise with what looked like six wires coming out of the head. And one of them was collected by these plume collectors. It was called Burlep's bird of paradise. And again, it turned up in Paris Hat Shop, but nobody knew where it had been collected. When I was in the Foja Mountains, I saw a female six-wired bird of paradise, but the female doesn't have the fancy plumage. And all I could say was some six-wired bird of paradise. About 20 years later, another ornithologist, Bruce Beeler from the United States, made a trip into the Foja Mountains, again with helicopter. And lucky Bruce, he saw the male of the six-wired bird of paradise, and it was the long-lost Burlep's six-wired bird of paradise. Those are the only two long-lost New Guinea birds, and they both turned up in the Foja Mountains. It proved to be the last big unexplored mountain range in New Guinea. There are some small. New Guinea has a central cordillera like the Central Range here in California that has Mount Whitney. And just as California has the Central Range and then lower outlying ranges like the San Gabriels and San Bernardinos, New Guinea has a Central Range that runs east-west rather than north-south here in California, and then outlying mountain ranges, which are smaller. The Foja Mountains are one of the higher and biggest of the outlying ranges, but there are some smaller outlying ranges in New Guinea. Over the course of, beginning in 1966, I started to explore these outlying ranges, many or most of which were unexplored, and we didn't even know where the highest peak was. The last of them, the unexplored peaks, I explored I attempted to explore it in 1993, but I couldn't get to the top. In 2013, a friend of mine who is much more daring than I chartered a helicopter, learned how to rappel out of a hovering helicopter through the canopy of rainforest. He descended to the floor of the summit of this mountain with his chainsaw, cleared an area big enough to construct a helipad. I and my friend then came in and landed on the helipad. And we did not discover a new, I take that back. We did not discover what is certainly a new species, but we discovered some very distinctive new subspecies, of which two may turn out to be new species.
Given your extensive work in conservation biology, what are some of the biggest challenges and successes you've seen in bird conservation, particularly in New Guinea?
Sure, let's talk about New Guinea. The biggest challenges in New Guinea are habitat destruction. Until Europeans pacified New Guinea tribes were at war with every neighboring tribe in a kaleidoscopic change of war and peace. And so it was dangerous for New Guineans to walk around in New Guinea. They could hunt in their own area. Now, with pacification, it means that it's safe to walk around, and also there are now guns in New Guinea, whereas there used to be just bow and arrow. Destruction of the forest is spreading in New Guinea. It's safe to go cut down trees, and that means it's safe to kill birds and animals, not just within 2 miles of your village, but you can go 5 or 10 miles away. So habitat destruction is a danger. Guns are a danger. The plume trade, especially the trade in parrots. New Guinea parrots are beautiful. New Guinea has about 50 species of parrots. Some of them are confined to New Guinea. There are lots of people around the world, Europeans and Americans, my former next-door neighbor, who likes New Guinea parrots. So New Guinea parrots sell for $10,000, $20,000, $70,000 in the United States and in Europe. It means that New Guineans go out and collect parrots and sell them to spoon to parrot traders. They're shipped out to Singapore and then they're shipped around the world. That's another big threat to New Guinea birds. That's bad news for conservation in New Guinea. Good news for conservation in New Guinea is that both the eastern half of the island, which is the country of Papua New Guinea, and the western half, Indonesian New Guinea, are making some attempts to set up national parks. The Indonesians, because the Indonesian government maintains a firm hand on what's going on in the country than does Papua New Guinea. I designed the national park system for Indonesian New Guinea. I place national parks where we know that there are distinctive birds and mammals. There are some rangers. The national parks are not very well protected for the most part, but at least they exist on paper, and some of them have some protection. So that's an encouraging sign. And in Papua New Guinea, the most encouraging development in Papua New Guinea is that there's a wonderful woman in Seattle, Lisa Dayback, at the Seattle Zoo, who loves tree kangaroos. I say tree kangaroos. You think of kangaroos as running around on the ground. Well, in New Guinea, because it's covered with rainforest, there are lots of, the biggest mammal of New Guinea are tree kangaroos. These are kangaroos up to 70 pounds that live up in trees, and they're very colorful. I discovered a tree kangaroo in the Foja Mountains, which is pink and yellow and red with stripes and spots. And you may think that I'm drunk, but no, this tree kangaroo has now been photographed. So Lisa Daybeck has persuaded New Guineans on the Huon Peninsula of Papua New Guinea to set aside large areas of their land for a conservation area. And in return, she has brought money in and she has provided schooling and sent people from that area out to get higher education in Australia. So it's in the interests of the people in this area to protect their tree kangaroos. That's the most encouraging development in conservation on the island of New Guinea.
And I just looked up what a tree kangaroo looks like, and definitely not what you would expect an Australian kangaroo to look like. They're a lot fluffier, it seems like.
They're much more attractive, with often rich red, although some of them are brown. And they live in trees. They live in the tops of trees. They come down to the ground rarely. If they're attacked by an eagle, they'll just let go in the canopy and drop down 90 feet onto the ground, feel a little stunned, shake their head, and then go bound away.
Better than becoming dinner.
Better than becoming dinner for the New Guinea harpy eagle, which is New Guinea's biggest bird of prey. It's not as big as the South American harpy eagle, but on one occasion in uninhabited New Guinea mountains, I was out looking for birds, and I was making my usual bird attracting sound, pss, 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 and I had the uncomfortable feeling something's watching me. And I turned around, and there, 15 feet from me, was a New Guinea harpy eagle that had heard the psh, psh, psh sound and had come in thinking that I was dinner. Fortunately, it didn't attack, but it has powerful legs. I would not have given the odds to me if it had chosen to attack me.
And even if it didn't attack you, which I'm glad that it didn't, for those that know what a harpy eagle looks like, they're quite intimidating.
Oh, well, with the powerful beak and with these legs that are almost as thick as my arm, and with these claws and with a firm grip. A friend of mine who has experience with eagles and hawks went out to a blind wearing really thick gloves, and he put some bait out there, and down came a harpy eagle. My friend reached out with his glove. The harpy eagle grabbed his hand with his glove, and my friend knew that there was no way that he was going to pull his hand away from the harpy eagle. He just had to stay there and wait until the harpy eagle got bored and released his hand.
You've spent decades birding in various locations, including your neighborhood in Stone Canyon. What are some of your most memorable birding experiences?
I'll give you two experiences, and one happened just a week ago. Here, I bird on my street, Stone Canyon, which is a dead-end street just north of the UCLA campus, and it's It's the slopes are covered with chaparral and oak, and so my list of birds here is 183 species. There's a species called the phainopepla. Every one of your listeners who's a birder will know what a phainopepla is. It's a remarkable bird. It's a female is gray, the male is black. The phainopepla is the only bird that we know here in California that has two separate breeding seasons in two locations. It breeds in the desert in the winter, and then in the spring, it moves here to the coast of Southern California and breeds again here in the spring. So you never see a phainopepla here in the coastal area in the winter until 3 weeks ago with my friend Nurit Katz, whom many people at UCLA will know. Nurit and I spotted a female phainopepla, the first time I've seen it in the winter here. And then last Sunday, I saw a male and a female phainopepla. Amazing. So that was a surprise here in Stone Canyon. A surprise for me in New Guinea is that in New Guinea, covered with jungle, most of my bird identifications are not by sight because you don't see birds up in the canopy. It's instead by sound. I'm musical, so I'm good at identifying birds by sound. But you have to, when you hear a call, when I started in New Guinea, there wasn't a field guide to New Guinea bird songs. I had to spend years identifying calls myself. And there was a beautiful call my first year. A far-carrying call. It obviously came from a mile or two away, but loud and far-carrying. And I asked the local New Guineans with me, what is that? And they said, oh, usurepo. That's the usurepo. Well, usurepo, that's the bird in their local language, the foray language, but who knows what the usurepo was. So I had to get to see an usurepo. Year after year, I would hear it calling. 2 years later, I finally thought I saw an usurepo. I was in the lowlands, and in the canopy, I thought, aha, now I look up, I'm going to identify the usurepo. I look up and I could see in the canopy of the tree, the foliage shaking. I thought, aha, I'm about to identify it. But at that same time, I had a big attack of scrub mites. There are pests in New Guinea, mites that bite you. And when they bite you, the itching, and they climb up your legs to your groin, and the itching is uncontrollable. So here I'm about to identify the usurepo, and all I can do is scratch the scrub mites. So that was 1966. I keep hearing usurepos year after year. Finally, in 1976, 12 years after I first heard it, I'm on the banks of the Fly River, New Guinea's biggest river, and I'm there on a boat, and right on the bank of the river, I'm hearing. I thought, aha, I'm going to identify the usurepo. And my guess was it was some sort of kingfisher. And the foliage shook, and out flew a bird. And what was it? It wasn't a kingfisher. It was the white-crowned cuckoo. I never would have guessed that that bird was the white-crowned cuckoo. It took me 12 years to identify the usurepo.
You said usurepo is the New Guinean way to say bird?
It's the name for that particular bird species in one particular tribe, the Foray tribe. There are 1,000 tribes and 1,000 languages in New Guinea. Each tribe has its own name for the 160 birds in its neighborhood. And usurepo was the name for this bird in the Foray language.
For those interested in ornithology or bird watching, what advice would you give them to get started and deepen their appreciation for birds?
Well, to get started in ornithology nowadays, it used to be, I got started when I was 7 years old, and it used to be that to get started in ornithology, you went out with binoculars and you listened and you learned the bird songs and you looked up, and if you heard an unknown song, you tried to track it down. And once you learned the songs, then you identified birds by song. Within the last decade, the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology has produced a recording of all North American bird songs. It's called Merlin. And so what young bird watchers do nowadays is they go out with their cell phone and they dial into Merlin, and Merlin is very good. Merlin then you point Merlin at the song, and Merlin pops up with the name of the song. Isn't that wonderful? The trouble is that sometimes Merlin is wrong, and increasingly the younger generation of ornithologists are not learning. They're not identifying birds themselves. Instead, they go out, they point Merlin, and they come back with their list from Merlin. They've not learned to identify birds, and Merlin is sometimes wrong. So my advice to people beginning in ornithology would be, don't take Merlin with you. And after you've learned the bird songs, take Merlin, but turn it on only because Merlin has better ears than I do. Turn on Merlin just to identify that there's some bird calling, and then you go identify that bird yourself. That's my advice to young bird watchers. Set your Merlin aside, and once you've learned the birds, point your Merlin, but use it to find a bird and then identify it by yourself.
I find it interesting how you're identifying ways technology has impacted birding as you see it now. With that said, what do you see as the future of ornithology? And what areas of research do you think will be the most important in the coming years?
The future of ornithology is similar to the past of ornithology. By that I mean that we've learned more about evolution and ecology and biology from birds than from any other animals. And the reason is clear. It's because birds are easy to observe, they're diurnal, they're not active at night like mice, but most birds, except for owls and nightjars, they're active when we are active during the day. Birds use the same senses that we do. Mammals depend especially on smell. But we humans are not particular. We don't identify things by smell. We identify things by sight and by sound. But birds identify things by sight and by sound. So birds are the best known animals. We've learned more about evolution and ecology from birds than from any other animals. And therefore, the future of birds is the same as the past of birds, namely they're the most easily studied, most useful animals to biologists. As for particular areas, within the last 15 years, genetics, molecular genetics, has hit ornithology just like it's hit other areas of biology. People are using DNA to study evolution in birds, and that's been very profitable. It's been good news and it's bad news. It means that the younger generation of graduate students of ornithology here at UCLA and elsewhere, they're doing their DNA and they're not paying attention to birds out in the field. But genetics is a growth area for ornithology. Another big growth area is culture and learning and memory. Turns out that birds have fantastic memories. The jays, like the scrub jays here, jays gather acorns, and in the fall, one jay will gather 4,000 acorns and bury them in 4,000 different places. The next spring, the jay remembers where those 4,000 acorns were. Well, we humans don't remember 4,000 acorns. What is it about birds that gives them this fantastic memory? Birds, they may have a language. UCLA's great ornithologist, Martin Cody, who retired a couple of decades ago, Martin Cody recognized that the California thrasher, which sings around here, it has a song consisting of about 70 different phrases and combines the phrases in different ways. Phrase number 1 is more likely to come with phrase number 73. The phrases of the thrasher, it appears that the thrasher might have a language. People are starting to study, people have identified simple languages for monkeys. They're beginning to recognize languages for birds, for chickadees. Chickadees have a word that means predator. Chickadees certainly have calls. The male has a call that says, "I'm handsome, come have sex with me." Female chickadees also have calls that say, "Come feed me." There's a lot to learn about learning and memory and culture in birds. That I see as a big area for the future study of birds.
Professor Diamond, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Your remarkable 58-year career at UCLA recently came to an end. Could you share any thoughts that come to mind from your time at UCLA?
I think that I've been currently the longest serving faculty member at UCLA. I came in 1966, and my last year of teaching was 2024. UCLA has been good to me. I've been happy at UCLA. I've been in 2 departments here, physiology and most recently geography. Both departments have treated me well. Most professors at most universities spend most of their time complaining about their departments. I spend most of my time being happy about both my departments, physiology and geography. I've had a very good time at UCLA, and I'm grateful to our institutions. And I'm grateful to UCLA students who have worked with me and I with them for decades. I still keep in touch with UCLA students who began to work with me in 1966.
Special thanks to Professor Jared Diamond, who retired in 2024 after a remarkable 58-year teaching career at UCLA. This is Alvaro Castillo with Tell Us What You Know, which was produced by Trevor Ducote for the UCLA College.